Imagine you have a client who has just successfully learned to identify a stop sign.
Okay.
I mean, it is a massive, life-altering win for their personal safety, right? They can walk down the street, see that red octagon, and they just know exactly what to do.
It's a huge milestone. Definitely.
Yeah. So you celebrate the achievement, the family celebrates, but here is the catch.
There's always a catch.
Always a catch. What if it took 6 months of daily, grueling 2-hour sessions to get there? Like, there were tears, intense frustration, and just a massive drain on everyone's energy.
Yeah, that changes the picture completely.
Exactly. They crossed the finish line. But, I mean, at what cost to that person's childhood?
Well,
When we talk about success in therapy or education, the picture we usually paint is simply crossing that finish line.
right, the outcome.
Just the outcome. But today, for this deep dive into our sources, which come to us from Amethyst Therapy Services for Behavioral Intelligence, we are laser focused on a completely different angle. We are diving into BCBA Foundation C.7.
Yes, measuring efficiency in behavior analysis.
Right. And for those of you who might be, like, brand new to the acronyms, a BCBA is a board-certified behavior analyst, and they practice ABA, or Applied Behavior Analysis.
Spot on.
And I really want to frame our entire conversation today around one core, maybe slightly uncomfortable question. If an intervention works like, if you finally hit the target, but the process takes forever, drains the entire budget, and completely exhausts everyone involved, is it actually a good intervention?
That's the ultimate at what cost scenario, really. And it's something every single practitioner has to grapple with at some point.
Because it's not just a philosophical debate, right?
No, not at all. In ADA, that question is a measurable ethical imperative.
Yeah.
I mean, we have a fundamental obligation to look at the resources consumed along the way. Because if we are, burning the village down to save it, so to speak, we are failing our clients.
Okay, let's unpack this. Efficiency is not just some cold corporate buzzword about maximizing profits on a spreadsheet. In this field, efficiency is fundamentally about respecting the learner's time, their energy, and frankly, their life. So here is the blueprint of what you are going to uncover today.
We've got a lot to cover.
We really do. First, we are decoding a micrometric called trials to criterion. Then we're going to look at how the sheer duration of training impacts a client's success.
Which is huge.
Oh, for sure. After that, we are unpacking the real human meaning of cost-benefit analysis in clinical settings. And finally, for those of you studying for the boards, we are revealing some of the most common traps that students fall into on the BCBA exam regarding this exact topic.
Yet measuring efficiency is really how behavior analysts ensure that the time, the resources, and the intense efforts being put forth are genuinely translating into meaningful life changes for the client.
Exactly.
If an intervention is effective but wildly inefficient, we're doing a massive disservice to the learner. Our job isn't just to teach a skill in a vacuum.
Right, it's about the real world.
Exactly. It's to teach that skill in a way that maximizes the client's opportunity to experience the natural reinforcers of the world, like the genuine everyday rewards of interacting with their environment as quickly and painlessly as possible.
So let's zoom in on the micro level first, just to understand how we actually measure this stuff. The first major metric from our sources is called trials to criterion.
Yes, trials to criterion.
Now, when someone outside the field hears the word trials, they immediately picture like a courtroom or maybe a pharmaceutical study.
Right, right.
What does this actually mean when you are sitting at a table with a learner?
Think of it as a strict measure of fluency. Trials to criterion tracks the total number of attempts or, instructional trials it takes for an individual to reach a predetermined level of mastery on a specific skill.
Okay, so just counting the attempts.
Exactly. It is not about getting lucky and getting it right once. It is a mathematical tracking of how many practice rounds it takes before the skill is solid, reliable, and meets the specific goal you've set.
To put this in perspective for you listening, it's kind of like learning to play a tricky chord sequence on a guitar.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Right. Like the first day you pick up the instrument, your fingers fumble, you have to look down at the frets, and when you finally strum, it sounds completely muted and awful.
We've all been there.
Exactly.
Right.
It might take you, say, 30 agonizing attempts to get one clean, resonant chord transition. But you keep practicing. A week later, you pick up the guitar, and it only takes you 3 attempts to find the sweet spot.
Yes.
That drop from 30 clumsy attempts down to 3 relatively smooth ones is your brain wiring itself for fluency. You are measuring the reps it takes to get to mastery.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it,
Hmm.
because what we are really tracking is the neurological and behavioral pathway becoming paved and smoothed out.
Right.
Let's look at a clinical application of this using the color concept example
Yeah.
from the Amethyst Therapy Services literature we're reviewing.
Okay, lay it on me.
Suppose you are teaching a young child the concept of the color red. You present them with items that are red and items that are, well, not red.
Makes sense.
To guide them, you use differential reinforcement, meaning you highly reward the learner when they correctly point to the red item, and you offer no reward, or perhaps gently redirect them, when they point to the wrong color.
Got it.
During this process, you track exactly how many of these instructional trials it takes for that child to reliably, consistently identify red.
So you basically establish a baseline metric for their learning speed. Let's say it takes 50 trials for them to finally master the concept of red. That's your starting data point.
Correct, 50 trials. But the true analytical power of this metric appears when you move to the next target.
Oh, okay.
Now you start teaching the color blue. If it takes the child fewer instructional trials to master blue, say 30 trials instead of 50, you now have concrete, objective evidence of the child's increasing agility.
Oh, wow. Because they are figuring out the game.
Exactly. They are not just memorizing colors. They are establishing a cognitive framework for categorization. They are learning how to learn within the structure you have provided.
That is so cool. But, okay, if you are an analyst staring at a data sheet filled with these numbers, what is your immediate takeaway? How does this change your behavior as a practitioner?
Well, it acts as an immediate diagnostic tool for your own teaching.
Your own teaching, not just the learner's progress.
Exactly. A low or decreasing number of trials to criterion means your intervention is highly efficient. The learner is acquiring this skill quickly, the reinforcements are working, the environment is optimized.
And if the number is high?
A persistently high number is a glaring red flag. It signals that either your teaching procedure is fundamentally flawed and needs immediate revision, or the learner requires much more individualized support.
Right, like something isn't clicking.
Yeah, maybe the reinforcer you're using just isn't motivating enough. Or maybe the verbal prompt you're using is confusing them. You do not just keep running trials indefinitely if the data shows the learner is stuck in the mud.
So you are essentially using the data as a mirror to critique your own teaching methods rather than blaming the learner for not catching on.
Exactly. It's on us to fix the environment.
Which brings up an interesting pivot. If counting trials tells us how much effort the learner is exerting, we also have to look at how much time that effort is stealing from their day.
Yes, the time factor.
That brings us to our second macro metric, training duration.
Training duration zooms out from the individual reps and looks at the clock. It is defined as the total amount of time required to achieve the desired behavior change or skill acquisition.
Okay.
And we have to evaluate this from two distinct angles. The length of the individual sessions, like are they 10 minutes or 2 hours, and the total accumulated time it takes across days, weeks, or months to finally master the skill.
But wait, let me play devil's advocate here. If we are obsessing over the clock and trying to compress the training duration to be as short as possible, aren't we just going to end up rushing a vulnerable client?
I hear that a lot.
Right. It feels like prioritizing speed could severely sacrifice the quality and depth of the learning.
That is a very common and understandable concern, but true efficiency in behavior analysis is never about rushing.
Okay, so what is it about?
It is about removing roadblocks. We want quicker learning without sacrificing quality. We aren't cutting corners to beat the clock. We are streamlining the environment so the client doesn't have to struggle unnecessarily.
Oh, I see.
We operate on the assumption that behavior is lawful, meaning it responds predictably to the environment. If a skill is taking an agonizingly long time to master, the problem is almost never the learner.
It's the setup.
Exactly. Long training durations are a signal to the analyst that the contingencies we've set up are not optimal.
You know, the sources highlight a real-world implication of this that honestly stopped me in my tracks.
Which one was that?
They give the example of a severely disabled child who is being taught a fine motor skill program. If that single program is so inefficient that it consumes hours and hours of her daily life, there is literally no time left in the day for her to learn other critical behaviors.
Like functional communication.
Yes. Or basic social skills.
Yeah.
The duration isn't just inefficient in a vacuum. It is actively stealing time from other developmental needs.
It is an issue of opportunity cost, and it is deeply problematic. We only have a finite amount of time with our clients, and our clients have a finite amount of time in their prime developmental windows.
Right, time is ticking.
Every hour spent on a poorly designed, redundant task is an hour lost for a critical life skill. If we eat up all their time with an agonizingly slow intervention, we're actively depriving them of other learning opportunities that could radically improve their independence.
Which naturally elevates this conversation to the ultimate human toll of these interventions. And here's where it gets really interesting.
Oh, definitely.
Because when most people hear the term cost-benefit analysis, they immediately picture a corporate boardroom. They think of dollar signs, profit margins, spreadsheets.
Yeah, accounting stuff.
Exactly. But in the context of applied behavior analysis, evaluating the cost is a completely different beast.
Financial costs are only one piece of a much larger, much more complex puzzle.
Right.
I mean, yes, an analyst or a clinic director must consider the literal cost of specialized equipment, staff salaries, transportation, but the true cost in a clinical setting heavily weighs the time, the physical effort, and the emotional resources of the client and their family against the projected benefits.
Wow, yeah. The emotional resource.
It is an accounting of human energy.
The bankruptcy of emotional resources is something that just doesn't get talked about enough. The sources provide some incredibly stark clinical examples to illustrate what this looks like in practice. Let's walk through them, starting with the out-of-state school scenario.
Right. So in that scenario, a school district or a family might be considering transporting a student with severe behavioral or learning disabilities to a highly specialized, expensive, out-of-state private school.
Which costs a fortune, I'm sure.
The financial cost is massive, often astronomical. But a true behavioral cost-benefit analysis also asks, is it worth the profound emotional toll of uprooting that child?
Yeah, separating them from their local community, their siblings, their familiar routines.
Exactly. Especially when comparable public services might exist locally. If the outcomes at the private school are entirely uncertain, the staggering emotional cost simply does not justify the potential benefit.
The benefit has to be overwhelmingly clear and guaranteed to justify that kind of disruption.
Absolutely.
There is another example in the text about an 11th grader with developmental disabilities. This student is currently placed in a rigorous college prep academic program because that is what the school's default track is.
And that default track generates a constant grinding state of stress.
I can only imagine.
It requires a massive amount of effort from the student to just barely keep their head above water, not to mention the anxiety it causes the parents and the extra hours required from special education teachers.
So the daily frustration and emotional exhaustion are incredibly high.
Extremely high. The behavior analyst has to look objectively at that situation and ask, what is the actual benefit to this specific human being?
Right, because college prep might not be the right path for them.
Exactly. If switching that student to a functional curriculum like one that teaches them how to navigate a grocery store, manage a bank account, or ride public transit would vastly improve their real-world employability and daily independence.
Then keeping them in the college prep track completely fails the cost-benefit test.
100%. The cost is too high, and the benefit is virtually non-existent for their actual future.
It all comes down to social validity. And social validity is the ultimate reality check. It basically asks, does this goal actually matter to the person's life?
Yes. Does it matter to them?
The text brings up an incredible example regarding pedestrian crossing signs. Imagine a practitioner spending hours and hours, week after week, running discrete trials to teach pedestrian crossing signs to a person who has severe mobility, sight, and hearing impairments.
Or consider the example of teaching a patient with advanced Alzheimer's disease to memorize the chronological order of the U.S. presidents.
Right. When I read that, my first thought was, why would anyone even target that behavior in the first place? What is the point?
Because it is very easy for practitioners to lose the forest for the trees. They fall into the trap of teaching for the sake of teaching, simply because they have the tools to do so.
Like, I can teach this, so I will.
Exactly. With enough time, prompting, and reinforcement, you might actually be able to teach those skills. You might hit your trials to criterion. But social validity demands that we step back and ask, does this have true value?
Will it actually help them?
Will this skill contact natural reinforcement in the client's environment? Meaning, when the therapist leaves the room, will the real world actually reward the client for knowing this skill?
And in both of those cases, the pedestrian signs for the bedridden patient, and the precedents for the Alzheimer's patient, the sheer time and frustration required far outweigh a benefit that is practically useless to their daily existence.
Exactly. It's a massive waste of their energy.
This framework is so empowering for you as the listener to understand whether you are an analyst, a teacher, or a parent. It gives you a lens to critically evaluate any intervention you see or participate in.
It really does.
It forces a shift in the conversation from the purely mechanical question of can we teach this to the deeply ethical question of should we teach this? Is the cost to this human being's quality of life actually worth the outcome?
That ethical foundation is precisely why the governing bodies in this field emphasize these efficiency concepts so heavily. It is about protecting the client.
Protect the client first, always.
Which naturally brings us to how this all translates into professional practice, and specifically how it shows up on the certification examinations.
Yes. Let's pivot from high-level clinical ethics to the nitty-gritty reality for those of you listening who are preparing for the BCBA exam or just looking to sharpen your daily clinical practice.
Good idea.
The sources from Amethyst Therapy outline several specific areas where students completely misinterpret these metrics. So let's talk about the pitfalls. Pitfall number 1 involves defining trials to criterion. How do test takers usually get this wrong on a multiple choice question?
The most common mock exam trick, and the mistake students consistently make in practice, is assuming that trials to criterion only measures the successful trials.
Oh, they just count the wins?
Right. They think it's just a tally of the correct answers. But in reality, it measures the absolute total number of trials, sessions, or opportunities required to meet a specific goal.
So everything is counted.
You must count the errors, the heavily prompted responses, the independent responses, absolutely everything. It is the total sum of attempts from the very first presentation until the mastery criterion is met.
Wait, why is it so critical to count the errors? Doesn't that just depress the data and make it look bad?
Because the errors tell a story. If you only count the correct trials, you have a completely warped view of how efficient the learning process actually was.
Oh, I see.
If it took 100 total attempts to squeeze out 10 correct responses, that tells a story of intense struggle and likely prompt dependence. It means your teaching method needs a total overhaul.
Because it's obviously not working well.
Right. But if it took 12 total attempts to get 10 correct, that tells a story of rapid acquisition. You have to measure the whole journey, bumps and all, to calculate true efficiency.
That distinction changes everything about how you view a data sheet. Okay, exam pitfall number 2. And I have to say, this one looks like a fascinating contradiction when you first read it.
I know exactly which one you're talking about.
We literally just spent the last 10 minutes talking about how vital cost-benefit analysis is and how we must meticulously weigh the costs before intervening. But according to the sources on the BCBA exam, cost effectiveness is never the primary reason to select a target behavior or an intervention.
Why, the sudden shift, it's like the rules just flipped.
It does seem contradictory at first glance, but it actually raises an incredibly important point about the hierarchy of clinical decision-making.
Okay, lay out the hierarchy for us.
Cost effectiveness is absolutely a factor. Practitioner experience is a factor. Client preference is a factor. But ethical behavior analysts must first and foremost prioritize interventions that are based on scientific evidence and positive reinforcement.
So science first.
Always. When you are looking at a test question or a real-world dilemma about selecting a treatment, you must look for the scientifically supported option first.
So you don't just pick the cheapest, easiest option because it saves the clinic money or saves the parents time.
Precisely. You select a target behavior based on what is in the client's best interest, and you select a treatment that is scientifically proven to be effective for that specific behavior.
Only after you have identified the evidence-based options do you start comparing their cost effectiveness and implementation efficiency. If you prioritize cost over science, you risk implementing a cheap, fast, but entirely non-functional treatment.
And providing ineffective treatment, no matter how cheap it is a direct violation of the core mandate to help the client.
Exactly. You have to be a scientist first and a resource manager second.
The science dictates the menu of options, and the cost-benefit analysis helps you choose the best meal from that specific menu.
There is a perfect synthesis of the hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
Science dictates efficacy. Cost-benefit dictates efficiency. You need both, but in that specific order.
Let's take a breath and synthesize the major aha moments we've covered on this journey through the material.
Sounds good.
Efficiency in applied behavior analysis, what the BACB categorizes as Foundation C.7, is truly the ultimate intersection of hard behavioral data and profound human empathy.
It really is.
We use trials to criterion to measure a learner's cognitive agility, proving they are actually acquiring skills faster over time and learning how to learn.
Yes.
We aggressively monitor training duration to ensure we aren't stealing a client's precious, finite developmental time with redundant or poorly designed teaching.
Protecting their time.
Exactly. And we rely on comprehensive cost-benefit analyses to guarantee that our interventions are practical, sustainable, and above all, socially valid for the actual human being sitting in front of us.
And by deeply understanding the mechanisms behind these metrics, you avoid the common professional pitfalls, like confusing total trials with correct trials, or prioritizing a budget over peer-reviewed scientific evidence.
So what does this all mean for you? Whether you are sitting in a quiet room agonizing over a stressful certification exam, or you are sitting at a small table with a client trying to teach them a new vital way to communicate. Measuring efficiency is what separates a rigid mechanical technician from a compassionate, adaptable behavior analyst.
I completely agree. And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, something that builds on the ethical undercurrent of everything we've discussed today.
Let's hear it.
Imagine a scenario where a behavior analyst perfectly implements a scientifically backed, evidence-based intervention. The literature supports it, and the methodology is absolutely flawless.
Okay.
But they completely fail to measure its efficiency. They don't track the duration, they don't count the total trials to criterion, and as a result, they allow their client to languish in a painfully slow, emotionally taxing program for 8 months with only minimal progress.
Wow.
Has that analyst, despite using the right science, actually violated the core ethical principle of doing no harm simply by wasting that client's time?
That is a heavy but incredibly necessary question to sit with as you evaluate your own practices. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the sources from Amethyst Therapy Services.
It's been a great discussion.
If you want to learn more, be sure to visit their website at www.amethysttherapyservices.com or reach out to them at info@amethysttherapyservices.com. Remember to stay curious, keep respecting your learner's time, and always keep questioning the why behind the data.
And we hope you'll stick around.
Absolutely. Stay tuned for our next dive into C.8, evaluating measurement validity and reliability. See you then.